I'm talking about authorship analysis in the context of forensic linguistics and meaning, which is, I think, an area that is of interest to corpus linguists. As I said, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It is a pleasure, and I hope I can at least bring up some interesting issues. I'm not so sure I will be able to answer that many issues, but let's see. Although I'm presenting in English, I will show some examples in Portuguese. I will try to gloss the most important ones, but speakers of Portuguese will be able to grasp the fun of some of the fine detail of the cases I'm talking about. Forensic linguistics is a fairly recent field, but it has evolved significantly over the last 2 decades, and it now allows for so many applications that it will be impossible to approach all of those applications here. So, although I won't be talking about corpus linguistics, I will try to focus on a few cases I've worked on, and some others that are very known in forensic linguistics, where the application of corpus linguistics can be helpful to assist forensic cases. So, one of the applications of forensic linguistics is the analysis of meanings. Meanings are everywhere, and somehow we assume they are pretty clear, but more often than not, they can be more complex than they appear to be. This is an example, what I'm showing is an example where meanings can be interpreted ambiguously. I'm sure that most of you, or at least those of you who have ever created an account with Google, for example on Gmail, have come across this screen and this contract. And it's obviously very few of you, if any, has read these terms and conditions, because usually we just want to scroll down and click the box and get on with it. So I'm sure you would be surprised if you read the whole thing, the whole terms and conditions, and perhaps that would make you think twice before going ahead with your sign-up procedure. But meanings can also be problematic in other contexts. A few years ago, and this is a case I worked on, a few years ago, the mayor of the Portuguese city of Porto, where I happen to be, accused the man of offense. Back then, the city published a restaurant guide. It was called Porto Menu, and only after it was published did the mayor realize that the picture in the front page, in the cover, contained what seemed to be an insult to the mayor, and that insult is the one we are seeing there. So that small writing there, Rio és FDP, so FDP. This is the Portuguese equivalent to Rio, you son of a bitch. It was written on the wall of a city building. Initially, everyone thought that the fact was overlooked when the picture was taken, so the writing was there already, and someone took the picture and they didn't realize the picture was there. But later on, the mayor realized that the text was not actually written on the wall. So the picture was found to have been manipulated to include the text. So a Photoshop work in here. The mayor took the case to court. There were 2 accusations against this man, one civil and one criminal, so he could actually go to jail. And the accusation claimed that FTP, so the Portuguese equivalent of SOB, was an offense, whereas the defense argued that FTP would stand for fanático dos popós, so the same initialism, which means a strong supporter of car races. This is because many people criticize the mayor for spending part of the city budget on car races, and they wouldn't agree too much with it. So the question is this initialism an insult? I would like you to think about this, and I will get back to this case later on. I will put you on hold for the moment. So just think about it. Is it an insult or is it not? In fact, meanings are very often disputed. Butters, a well-known forensic linguist, describes how in 2003 the McDonald's Corporation announced their objection to the Merriam-Webster's dictionary new entry, McJob. So there was this entry on Merriam-Webster's, and it was defined on the basis of actual usage as a low-paying job, and I'm quoting here, that requires little skill and provides little opportunity for advancement. Later, in 2007, they also put pressure on Oxford English Dictionary after they added a similar entry and a similar definition. Butters then argued that McDonald's were trying to change the lexicographer's conclusions about the public perception of the connotations of McJob. So this brings us to a very interesting definition or a very interesting concept of what a definition is. Lexicographers, just as well as corpus linguists, are very good at it. So this is a very interesting approach to meaning. But what is all this about forensic linguistics? Forensic linguistics is basically, and put very simply, linguistics applied to forensic contexts. Forensic linguistics consists of applying linguistic analysis, whatever part of linguists we're talking about, to forensic contexts. Coulthard and Johnson defined it as having both a broad and a narrow definition. So the broad definition subsumes three different sub-areas: the written language of the law, the spoken interaction in legal contexts, and language as evidence. The latter, language as evidence, is what defines forensic linguistics in the narrow sense, and it's the most well-known area of forensic linguistics. So, for example, one of the things I'm talking about, which is authorship analysis, is part of this narrow definition, language as evidence. Some of the things that forensic linguistics is not is handwriting analysis. People usually ask, well, if I give you a text, can you look at the handwriting and tell me who the author is? No, I don't do that. I'm not a handwriting analyst. I'm a linguist. It's not psychological analysis. I've been asked if I could look at someone else's writing and guess what sort of a psychological person that person was. So we don't do that. We don't even guess intentions, because that's up to psychologists. We work with the power of language. So we look at language, we see how language works, and make our decisions based on that. Talking about language as evidence, when we do some authorship analysis work, we try to find out who wrote questioned text from a group of possible authors. This is what computational linguists usually call a classification problem. So we don't usually try to identify the suspect from an infinite pool of possible authors. It's just a small number, usually up to 4 or 5 at most, or maximum, because otherwise it's impossible to compare. We can also do some sort of social linguistic profiling. This has nothing to do with psychological profiling. What we try to guess is look at the text and see what sort of linguistic person wrote that text. It may be nationality, it may be non-native speaker of a language, it may be age group or gender or social class, and so on and so forth. Some cases where forensic linguistics was used very successfully include one of the most paradigmatic cases in the history of this field of knowledge. In 1952, Derek Bentley and Chris Craig were seen climbing up to the rooftop of a warehouse in London. Derek Bentley was 19 at the time. Craig was 16, and someone called the police, and then a shot was heard and one of the policemen was killed. Craig, because he was minor, was sentenced to life, but Bentley was sentenced to death for inciting Craig to fire. And all this conviction was based on one sentence that Derek Bentley was supposed to have said, which is, "Let him have it, Chris." So again, this is a matter of meaning, because what is it that this would mean? What did it mean to say, "Let him have it, Chris"? The accusation and the police said that it meant, "Shot him, Chris," whereas the defense argued that it meant, "Chris, give them the gun." Okay, so there was a case. Bentley was actually executed, but in 1998, Bentley was pardoned posthumously, largely due to linguistic evidence. The judge claimed that the robustness of the linguistic evidence depended on the credibility of the police, and the linguistic analysis actually showed that the statement was a dialogue converted into a monologue, and also concluded that the text was too sophisticated for Bentley, because Bentley had an IQ of about 90, but still he kept saying in his statement, he kept saying he, then, rather than he. Okay, so the postposition of the adverb mentioned that it was not natural for Bentley to write something like that. One of the things we also do when we work with forensic linguistics as evidence is on plagiarism detection and analysis. In this case, we try to see if a text, a question text, is an original or a reproduction of another text in whole or in part, or whether two texts have been produced independently, or if they are a result of collusion, where two people have worked together to produce a joint piece of work where it's supposed to be original. So authorship and plagiarism are both based on the assumption that when we produce some sort of text, we tend to be original. We tend to produce a language that is unique to our own. So the question is, if we learn the same language from the same books, if we learn the lexis from the same dictionaries, if we learn grammar from the same grammar books, how is it possible that we can be identified by the language that we speak or write? Sorry, I was just having a drink. So this is based on the established principle of idiolect. Idiolect argues that we all have our own unique way of speaking, of producing text. So no two different people or the same person at different points in time would produce exactly the same sort of text, which makes us think that language is inimitable. Okay, so we are not supposed to be able to imitate other people's text. A recent case you may have heard about is this of the New York Times. A while ago, there was an op-ed published in the New York Times. It was supposed to have been written by someone from inside the White House who denounced several acts or misdeeds by the Trump administration. And the punchline is, "I work for the president, but like-minded colleagues and I have vowed to thwart parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations." And immediately people try to look at this from a forensic linguistics perspective, from an authorship analysis perspective, and trying to find out who may have written this op-ed. And there was a guess that the text was actually written by the Vice President, Mike Pence. And this was based on a single assumption. That is because the op-ed used quite a rare word, which was lodestar. The problem is, when we do authorship analysis, we can't base our findings on a single marker. We need a set of markers, because the fact that someone uses lodestar, just that is not enough to attribute authorship to someone. And the fact is that if you try, I'm not saying this, I'm not telling you how to pretend you're someone else when writing a text, but it is obvious that if you try to imitate someone else's writing, usually you imitate the lexis, okay? And that is because usually grammar is far more difficult to imitate, or people don't pay that much attention to it. So if someone wanted to pretend to be Mike Pence, because they knew he was known for this word, they would probably use it. And also there's another thing, which is Mike Pence doesn't write his own speeches. He has a team of people writing for him. So probably the word is not even his own. Okay, so it's not very scientific to attribute the text to Mike Pence just based on this word. I'm now going back in time to talk about one of the most famous cases involving forensic linguistics. You may have seen this, it was quite, not all the facts were actually facts in the series, but you may have seen this on TV. It's the case of Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. Ted Kaczynski sent letter bombs from 78 to 1995, and in 1995 he wrote a manifesto called Industrial Society and Its Future. It was a 35,000 words manifesto. He sent the manifesto to the newspapers and promised the newspapers to stop sending letter bombs if they actually published it. What happened was that the newspapers didn't want to publish it, but then the FBI asked them to actually publish it. So when the manifesto was published, someone read it and called the FBI, saying, well, you know, this looks like a relative of mine, and we haven't seen him for a while, but this is really his writing. So the FBI tried to find him. They found his house, and they found some writing in there, including a piece of local newspaper article he had written on the same topic. It was just about 300 words. So the FBI hired a linguist. The linguist did an analysis and reached the conclusion that Ted Kaczynski was the one who actually wrote the manifesto and the one who sent the letter bombs. The defense also hired a linguist, and based on the findings of the linguists hired by the FBI, came up with 13 of the words or phrases that he used, and argued that, well, any speaker of English would be perfectly capable of using any of these words or sentences. And actually it's true, because, I mean, on the other hand, propaganda, at any rate, presumably, all these words and phrases are very common, so any speaker of English can actually use them. The thing is, what the linguist hired by the FBI said was that, yes, that's right, anyone can use one of these words or phrases individually, but the fact is that there's only Ted Kaczynski who uses exactly this set of words and expressions. So, and he was later proven to be the Unabomber. Of course, forensic linguistics has some challenges because we're talking about an interdisciplinary area here. We resort to linguistic knowledge for forensic purposes. It's not always easy to convince the courts, for example, that linguistic evidence is true and accurate. There's also a criticism that is usually made to linguists and linguistics, which is that linguistics is not an objective science, rather it is subjective, which is not true at all, because if you think about a text or a set of texts, if I ask you to say parse that text, you will parse it as any other linguist. So that sounds pretty much objective to me. And the other challenge is how to present the results of the analysis to non-linguists. I worked on a case recently where I had to explain to the court that meanings can be interpreted differently depending on the context. So basically, I had to tell the judge what pragmatics was, and that's not always easy if you think about it. There are also two other crucial aspects. One of them is the data. Forensic linguists need to work with real data. It's not always easy to come across real forensic data, but what we do to train methods, for example, is use general data as long as it's real, and then try to apply it in forensic context as well. And it's also important to use tried and test methods and tools. For example, corpus linguistics is often used as a tool in forensic contexts. Now, one of the most recent challenges and applications of forensic linguistics is cybercrime. As we know, criminals, there's a tendency for criminals to resort to technological innovation when practicing technology-enabled crimes, so online crimes, and this is one of the greatest challenges that is faced by law enforcement officers. But cybercrimes are technology-enabled crimes. They are virtual, but they mimic the real, they adapt reality, and often, even though they are virtual, they impact reality. Think about a website telling you how to set up a bomb. If the bomb goes off, actually, then it means that it's not virtual, it's quite real. Okay, so there is, some crimes may be virtual, but they have a real impact in society. The feature of cybercrime, or one of the most prominent features of cybercrime, is that they are crimes enabled by language. So it is important to resort to digital evidence. And I worked with, within the scope of the Cybercrime Lab project, I worked with the Portuguese Prosecutor General's office on a few cases involving language. The first one was a peer-to-peer file sharing case. Peer-to-peer file sharing is very peculiar in that it uses the ordinary computers and bandwidth infrastructure of companies or at home. They are usually largely anonymous, and the distribution of content is free from almost any form of control by third parties. In this case, there was a website. It shared copyright protected material, and there was also a Facebook page where the new launches were advertised. The problem is the prosecutor's office was able to identify the owners of the website, but they were not able to identify those who ran the Facebook page. They asked Facebook to give them that information, but as often happens with companies, and especially social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, or even Google, they don't even bother to respond to the requests of the Portuguese investigators. So the prosecutor's office decided to ask for a comparison of the text of the website and the Facebook page. We're looking at an extract of the website. This is an extract of the Facebook page, and if we look at them side by side, you will see by the colors and the shapes, you will see that there are some recurrent patterns that are shared between both extracts. And when I actually analyzed the text, I found that they were similar in several respects. For example, 3/4 of the sentences started with initial lowercase, which is not grammatical. There were problems with accents and diacritics. There were problems with prepositions. The contractions used were the same across the two sets of texts. There was a lot of homophone substitution. There was confusion with verbs, verb tenses. subjunctive and impersonal. There was lack of agreement in number or gender, and the abbreviations used were the same. There were punctuation and spacing were used erratically, and interestingly, both texts were written in European Portuguese for the most part, and every now and then there were bits of text written in Brazilian Portuguese. Now, this raised an interesting question, which is that we wondered how part of the text was Brazilian. So my guess was that there was a group of people producing the texts, and that group included at least one Brazilian. And that's how most of the texts were written in European Portuguese, and every now and then there were texts in Brazilian Portuguese. I'm skipping this case, the second one, because we are now 24 minutes and there's still a lot I want to talk to you about. And I will move on to the third case. The third case is a case of cyberstalking. Text messages were sent to a woman from 2 different mobile phone numbers. They were not registered, and those messages denounced the immoral practices of her husband. A handwritten message, which you can see in the screenshot, was also produced. The investigators had no suspects for this, so the aim was to help the investigators establish the social linguistic profiling of the author of the message. Now, as most of you I assume have an interest in corpus linguistics, there's a problem with this. It's that the 3 sets of texts have a very small number of text. So 448 words, 122 words, and the third message was only 16 words long. So this is one of the problems of the analysis, is that it had to face with a small number of words. So we couldn't really go for a corpus linguistic analysis and extract all the quantitative details. So we had to follow a different approach, which was to stick to the final detail of the text used, and especially look at lexis and grammar. And that's where it gets interesting. If we look at, and this is just 3 examples, if we look at text messages 1 and 2, we will see that there are some overlapping patterns. For example, in the first case, there is a problem with agreement in number. The second one is a case of homophone substitution, and so this can work as idiosyncratic material. And the most interesting thing is a very rare collocation, which is homem de sida. So you can refer to someone who has AIDS. That person who has AIDS is not usually in Portuguese referred to using this collocation. So it doesn't, the preposition de is not used in this case. And if you want to try it yourself, even for those of you who can't really speak Portuguese, if you do a Google search and see how many hits of the collocation you are able to find, you will see probably, as I did earlier today, because I tested it before doing this presentation, I tried it myself, and the result was none. So this shows how rare this collocation is. And it turns out that the patterns identified are typical of African Portuguese, which allowed the investigators to narrow down the pool of suspects to a certain group of people. And actually, often the fact that other people misunderstand our intended meanings, because as linguists we know that meanings are very complex, can lead to dangerous situations. Probably you heard about this case. Some years ago, Brian Lee posted a tweet inviting a friend to catch up before he went on holidays to Los Angeles. On arrival at Los Angeles airport, he and his friend were arrested. they were questioned as suspects of terrorism, and then they were sent home. So they were not allowed in the States. The phrase, "before I go and destroy America," which is in his tweet, which he argued meant he simply wanted to go and have a good time and fun in America, was interpreted differently by the US Department for Homeland Security, who took it as a threat. So how can we safely establish whether a statement is a threat or not? For example, is this a threat? This picture was taken at my faculty, and should we look at this and take it as a threat? It could be. Okay, so determining meanings is very complex and also very exciting at the same time. And when we talk about disputed meanings, an area where forensic linguistics has been very helpful is in cases not only of defamation, but also in cases of hate speech. Detecting hate speech is particularly problematic because, as with threats, meaning is contextual. So words acquire their meaning in context. They don't come with a fixed meaning, which makes it hard for computer scientists to devise detection algorithms. For example, you can't say that a tweet is hate speech just because it uses the word, say, fag, okay, or nigger. And that's because if you belong to that group, you would probably use that word anyway, and it's not offensive, it's not hate speech. So, and on the contrary, some apparently inoffensive words may be used offensively. For example, there was a case in Europe where the word Hungarian was used in that sense. And the same, in some cases, we often use in Portugal, about how the word Brazilian is used, and sometimes is used with quite a negative connotation. So for forensic linguistics, it is important to identify suspect communications. It is important to identify hate speech. And I'm afraid I don't have final conclusions about this, because the findings that I have of my recent research are not final yet, so that's why I can't really share them with you. But although results are not yet final, the preliminary findings show that some strategies like using affixes can be a good predictor of hate speech, at least in Portuguese. And it allows, for example, to identify prejudice. So now going back to the son of a bitch case, I would like to ask the same questions again. Does FDP, the Portuguese equivalent of SOB, mean unambiguously filho da puta, or son of a bitch? And how can we prove or disprove the meaning of the initialism? As I said, forensic linguists are very good with language, but not competent to deal with or guessing a speaker's intentions. And one way forensic linguists can establish meanings is by surveying speakers of the language. In this case, that wouldn't help much, because first, Porto inhabitants are famous. If you didn't know that, you will know it now. Porto inhabitants are famous for their intensive use of swear words. So a survey would agree that the initialism actually means son of a bitch. Secondly, general speakers of a language are not linguistics experts, so they are not consciously aware of the fact that swear words are not always used offensively. And thirdly, surveying people on the street would certainly lead to awkward situations. I'm sure that surveying people in Porto, people would tend to think you were making fun of them. So a different strategy was adopted in this case. I used the web as corpus to establish not whether FDP means son of a bitch, but rather to answer the question, which was, I must say, cleverly formulated by the lawyers, which was, does FDP means unambiguously filho da puta? So here it is. I did a Google search, and as we see, there are so many possibilities, and these are just the top hits returned by Google. There are so many possibilities, and one of them is obviously the Portuguese equivalent of son of a bitch. but it's not the only one, which pretty much answers the question asked by the lawyers. I also ran the same search on a Portuguese search engine, Sapo, where Filho da Puta showed as the first hit, but then there were also other possibilities. And interestingly, these hits clearly pointed to the fact that the meaning of FTP, as I said, was not unambiguous, but I thought it would be good to cross-check these results against a lexicographical approach. But because swear words can hardly be found in regular dictionaries, I ran a search on Brazilian Dicionário Informal. Sadly, we don't have a version for that in Portugal, so that's why I use the Brazilian source. And these are the findings. And for those of you who can speak Portuguese, I particularly like number 4. I think it's quite interesting. I'm sorry to non-speakers of Portuguese because I can't really translate number 4. Not because I don't want to, but I wouldn't know how to translate that into English, because I think it's a very Brazilian thing. So my conclusion was that different meanings can be associated with different signifiers, conventionally or conversationally. We know that abbreviations and initialisms are often conversational. Each speaker creates their own initialisms and abbreviations, so their meaning prevails. For example, in this case, because FTP was argued by the defense to mean fanático dos popós, whenever someone wanted to insult someone else, they wouldn't say filho da puta, the Portuguese equivalent to son of a bitch. They would say fanático dos popós. Okay, so this tells a lot about how meanings are resignified. Also, FTP varies according to groups, regions, and language varieties. For example, the Porto Football Club, or the supporters of Porto Football Club, include this swear word in their when they sing, when they play against their rivals. And it's as I said, Porto inhabitants are very keen on using swear words more often than other people in the country, and it can also be prominent in some language varieties. For example, in Brazilian Portuguese, it can have particular and peculiar connotations. And the connotation is not always negative. For example, I mentioned the Brazilian case, and it is a fact that sometimes in Brazil, if you want to say something is very good, you will say, this is filho da puta. For example, this wine is son of a bitch, and this means that it is excellent. And we have to bear in mind that speech acts and communicative intentions should also be taken into account, and we cannot forget locutionary, illocutionary, and perlocutionary acts. So my conclusion was that it cannot be established that FTP unambiguously means filho da puta. Rather the contrary, we saw that there are several possibilities for this initialism. So to conclude, and I promise this is my last slide, as forensic analysis, we look, as Roger Choi, a forensic linguist, mentioned, we look at the motive within language evidence. We help locate the right suspects. That's what we do when we work with the police. We try to establish what illegal activities were planned and by whom, and assist with effective intelligence analysis of the evidence. And quoting Choi, I agree that an operation needs to have good reason to suspect that some kind of terrorist activity is happening or is likely to happen. Simply trolling for possible suspects is not an acceptable procedure. And this is very true because one of the aims of forensic linguistics is to assist a fair and just administration of justice. So we have to take this into account. And I end here.